My arrogant father dragged me into a crowded courtroom expecting me to beg for his mercy because I had no money and zero legal help. But he had absolutely no idea I was the exact ghost who already destroyed his famous attorney 2 years ago. Before I tell you about the explosive moment that brought a local empire to its knees, let me know where you are watching from in the comments section. Thank you for being here. Grab a warm glass of water, sit down, and listen to me tell the whole story. I stepped out of the freezing rain and into the heavy, suffocating air of the Marlow County Civil Court. It was a bleak morning in North Carolina, the kind of morning that soaked straight through your coat and settled deep in your bones. But the chill inside courtroom number 4 had nothing to do with the weather outside. It came from the solid wooden benches and the people sitting on them. The room was packed far beyond its capacity. Every single seat was taken. People lined the back walls, standing shoulder to shoulder, their wet umbrellas dripping onto the faded linoleum floor. Briar Glen was not a large town. People here lived on local drama and whispered secrets. Today, the main event was me. They had crammed into the gallery eager for blood. They wanted to watch the great Mercer family take out their own trash in public. I walked down the center aisle. I did not rush. I carried 3 heavy cardboard boxes of documents. I held one tightly in my arms and pulled the other 2 stacked on a rusted metal dolly behind me. The wheels squeaked faintly. That was the only sound in the room. The murmurs and whispers died down the exact second I pushed through the heavy double doors. I wore a simple dark blue suit and flat, sensible shoes. My hair was combed back neat and tight. I did not look like a man begging for mercy. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead on the judge's bench. At the defense table sat my father, Robert Mercer. He was the real estate and logistics titan of our county. Earlier that morning, I had watched him step out of the back seat of his pristine, custom-ordered Rolls-Royce Ghost right in front of the courthouse steps, waving to his friends like he was running for mayor. Now, he wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my entire apartment. He sat perfectly straight, his chest pushed out, owning the space. He looked like a king waiting for a peasant to kneel. He owned the local warehouses. He owned the trucking routes. He basically owned half the town council. Beside him sat my older brother, Julian Mercer, the golden boy. Julian was scrolling on his phone, acting completely bored, playing the part of the untouchable prince who had much better places to be. His brand new Porsche 911 was parked in the reserved lot out back, likely paid for by the very company funds I was here to discuss. Flanking them both was their ultimate weapon, Carter. Carter was not just a lawyer. He was a corporate executioner. He charged a massive salary of $1,000 an hour just to bury his client's enemies under mountains of procedural motions. He was the man you hired when you wanted to drain the opposing side of every single penny before a trial even began. Carter leaned back in his expensive leather chair. He tapped a heavy gold pen against his legal pad. He did not even bother to look up when I reached the plaintiff table. I was nothing to him, just another annoying bug to be squashed before his lunch break. I set my boxes down. The dull thud echoed loudly in the high-ceilinged room. I opened the top box and pulled out my primary binder. Robert turned his head. He looked at me, taking in my damp suit and my distinct lack of legal counsel. He looked at the empty chair beside me. A cruel, practiced smile stretched across his face. He leaned back, took a slow breath, and spoke. He did not whisper to his lawyer. He projected his voice so the sound would carry perfectly to the crowded gallery behind us. You could not even afford a lawyer. The words hung in the stale air. They were designed to cut deep. They were a public declaration of absolute power, a reminder of my place at the bottom of his world. A few scattered chuckles drifted from the back rows. My father's friends, his golf partners, his dependent contractors. They were laughing with him. They were laughing at me. The crowd believed him completely. I did not flush with anger. I did not lower my head. I simply opened my thick binder and laid it flat on the dark oak table. I took a slow, steady breath. The heavy wooden doors behind the bench swung open. The bailiff called the room to order. Everyone stood. Judge David walked in and took his seat high above us. Judge David was an absolute institution in Marlow County. He had eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He did not tolerate time wasters. He opened the case file placed before him and looked down at the paperwork. Usually, when a self-represented litigant stands before a judge, you see a flash of deep irritation in the judge's eyes. People who represent themselves usually bring messy handwritten complaints full of emotional rambling and zero legal standing. Judge David looked at my filing. He did not sigh. He turned the first page, then the second. The silence in the room began to stretch. It stretched so long that the gallery stopped shuffling their wet feet. Judge David looked at the document as if he had just reached into a dark drawer and touched the cold steel of a loaded gun. It was a look of pure, unadulterated respect for the danger hidden in those pages. He looked straight at me. He did not say a single word, but the entire atmosphere in the room shifted. At the defense table, Carter let out a quiet sigh of boredom. He reached out with his manicured hand and pulled his copy of my opposition binder toward him. He casually flipped open the heavy cover. I watched his hands. I watched his face. Carter grabbed the corner of the first page to turn it, but his fingers suddenly stopped. His hand froze completely in midair. His eyes darted to the top left corner of the document. Then his eyes snapped to the center. The expensive gold pen slipped from his grip. It clattered loudly onto the wooden table. Carter flipped quickly to the next page, then the next. His breathing changed. The smug, relaxed posture vanished instantly. His shoulders tensed so hard they practically touched his ears. The healthy color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified old man facing a firing squad. He recognized the brutal, surgical precision of the legal arguments. He leaned forward, his nose almost touching the paper. He whispered, and the courtroom was so utterly silent that his whisper carried across the tense gap between our tables. "My God, is that really him?" It was barely a breath, but it was enough. Robert heard it. He frowned heavily. He turned his head to look at his high-priced lawyer. For the first time in his long, arrogant life, my father saw Carter lose his rhythm. Carter was not looking at the judge. He was looking at me like I was a ghost. Robert shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The triumphant, mocking smile slipped right off his face. Complete confusion replaced it. He looked from his terrified lawyer to the stack of papers, and then finally he looked back at me. He searched my face for the obedient son who always backed down to save the family name. I met his gaze. I did not blink. My pulse was beating slow, calm, and steady. Robert did not know yet. The man he had gleefully prepared to humiliate in this courtroom was gone forever. He died the day my father locked him out of the office and destroyed his good name. Now, let me tell you exactly how I buried that man, and how I built the ghost that was about to rip this empire apart. I did not grow up in a normal family. I grew up inside a localized power structure. In a place like Briar Glen, the Mercer name was a master key that unlocked every single door. Whenever my father walked into a crowded room, the entire local business council stood up in unison to shake his hand. They called him the rebuilder of the county. He wore that title like a heavy gold crown, and he made sure everyone in our household polished it daily. Inside our house, the rules were never written down, but they were carved into the very foundation. The golden son inherits the kingdom. The other son handles the dirty work nobody else wants to touch, cleans up the messes, and then stays perfectly quiet about it in the background. That was the natural, undisputed order of things in my father's universe. Julian was born to stand in the spotlight. I was born to sweep the floor beneath it. But I was never a fragile thing. I observed. I learned exactly how systems worked. I had a mind that naturally gravitated toward hard logic and concrete facts. I was exceptionally good at risk analysis. I could read a 300-page commercial contract and find the single lethal loophole hidden deep in paragraph 42. I used those specific skills to build my escape route. After finishing college, I packed my bags and moved to a major city on the East Coast. I built a very quiet, very successful life for myself as a corporate compliance and risk restructuring expert under my full legal name, Elijah Watson. I dropped the Mercer name entirely. Every corporate compliance certification, every published paper on business failure analysis was registered to Elijah Watson. My father absolutely hated it. It was a daily, legally binding reminder that I existed entirely outside his jurisdiction. Then, the family empire started trembling. Mercer Corridor Group had expanded way too fast. My father and Julian had bought up too much industrial land, signed too many high-interest commercial loans, and completely ignored the operational foundation required to support that kind of aggressive growth. They were drowning in their own ambition. My father called me on a cold Tuesday night. He did not ask for a favor like a normal parent. He gave a directive. He used a tone of voice that implied I owed him my very existence. He told me to come home for just 6 months. He said he needed exactly 6 months to stabilize the system so he could focus entirely on taking care of my aging mother. It was the perfect trap, baited with family duty. I packed up my independent life and drove back to Briar Glen. I truly believed it was a temporary mission. The company was an absolute disaster zone. I rolled up my sleeves and went to work. I spent 16-hour days untangling their massive mess. I reorganized their entire commercial insurance portfolio. I reviewed hundreds of sloppy vendor contracts and renegotiated the terrible terms Julian had agreed to. I pulled 3 massive commercial loans back from the absolute brink of default by restructuring their financial covenants at the 11th hour. I built a functioning, profitable machine out of the rusted scrap metal they handed me. But the promised 6 months passed, then a year passed. Every single time I tried to hand the reins back to them and pack my bags, another manufactured crisis would suddenly appear out of thin air. And the most sickening part of all was watching how my exhausting work was digested by the family public relations machine. Every loan I saved, every brutal compliance audit I passed, was smoothly repackaged for the public. At town hall meetings and Chamber of Commerce dinners, my father would proudly slap Julian on the back. He would announce to the crowded room that Julian was doing an absolutely fantastic job navigating the company through a tough economic quarter. I was never mentioned. I never received a promotion. I never saw a bump in my salary. I was the ghost in the machine. I was the invisible engine making the golden boy look like a genius. Sitting in my dark office late at night, watching Julian take full credit in the local newspaper for a complex risk mitigation strategy one had spent 3 weeks building from scratch, the cold truth finally hit me. My father did not hate my talent. He desperately needed my brain to keep his empire from collapsing. The only thing Robert truly hated was the fact that my talent existed entirely outside his direct control. He wanted to consume my identity until there was nothing left but a useful tool for the Mercer legacy. Julian loved the applause. He thrived on the adrenaline of closing a big deal. What he absolutely hated was the slow, meticulous process of doing things legally. He viewed my compliance framework as an annoying speed bump slowing down his personal ambition. So Julian started finding creative ways to bypass my system. Started small. I noticed several new landscaping and site clearing vendors had been on board without completing the mandatory background financial checks. They were shell companies, backyard suppliers set up by his drinking buddies to catch the runoff cash from our massive construction budgets. Then I noticed the payment structures. Julian was intentionally breaking down large vendor invoices into smaller, distinct clusters of payments. He was authorizing wire transfers just under the $10,000 federal reporting threshold to avoid triggering automatic bank alerts and internal compliance reviews. In the eyes of the federal government, it is a massive red flag for fraud. I started digging deeper into the digital archives. That was when I found the first forged document. It was a routine soil testing clearance invoice. The invoice had a strange, irregular approval stamp. I pulled up the digital routing log, and my blood ran cold. Right there at the bottom of the screen, glaring back at me, was my own electronic signature. The system recorded that I had personally reviewed and approved the clearance at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. I had never even opened that specific project folder. I checked another file, then another. My digital signature was stamped across dozens of expedited payments that completely bypassed my department. I immediately printed the logs and walked straight into Julian's corner office. I dropped the papers flat on his glass desk and demanded a full independent forensic audit of the entire payment system. Julian did not even flinch. He just laughed. He leaned back in his leather chair, tossed his keys to the Porsche on the desk, and smoothly blamed the entire discrepancy on a glitch in the recent accounting software migration. We both knew he was lying. Before Julian could spin another lie, my father walked into the office. He closed the heavy oak door behind him. He looked at the printed logs on the desk. Then he looked at me. His expression hardened into a familiar mask of paternal disappointment. He simply wanted the conflict to end so the machine could keep moving. He told me to lower my voice. He said I was overreacting to a minor administrative oversight. When I pushed back, pointing out the severe legal liabilities of forged compliance documents, he cut me off completely. He stepped closer, invading my personal space, and lowered his voice into a dangerous, commanding register. "Do not act like an outside lawyer," he said. "You are family." That single sentence was the psychological skeleton key to his entire operation. It was the ultimate weapon of silence. Whenever I demanded professional standards, whenever I pointed out a blatant violation of the law, they threw the word family in my face. It was designed to make me feel disloyal. They demanded the rigorous expertise of a high-paid corporate attorney, but they expected the blind, unquestioning obedience of a silent son. I left the office that afternoon with a sickening realization. If Julian was attaching my electronic signature to domestic invoices, what else were they putting my name on? I spent the next 48 hours secretly mirroring the outbound email servers. I needed to see exactly what was being sent to our external financial partners. I sat in my dark apartment, drinking black coffee, parsing through thousands of encrypted attachments. The truth I uncovered was far worse than petty embezzlement or lazy contracting. My father and my brother were using my hard-earned professional reputation as a bulletproof shield. Every single credit application sent to the regional banks, every bid submitted to the State Development Board prominently featured my credentials. The banks trusted the Mercer Corridor Group solely because Elijah Watson was listed as the chief guarantor of regulatory adherence. My name was the only thing making their dirty money look clean. The final, terrifying piece of the puzzle fell into place late on a Friday night. I was reviewing a secured loan packet for a massive multi-phase logistics hub planned near the riverfront. It was the absolute crown jewel of my father's expansion strategy. But the land sitting beneath the proposed site was highly unstable. It was an old chemical dumping ground that required millions of dollars in mandatory environmental remediation before a single shovel could touch the dirt. The liability was astronomical. If the chemical seepage reached the nearby water supply, the resulting federal fines would bankrupt the company overnight. Attached to the final page of the loan guarantee was a formalized certificate of environmental compliance. It falsely stated that all preliminary soil remediation had been successfully completed according to strict federal standards. And sitting right at the bottom of that fraudulent, highly illegal document was my verified electronic signature. My stomach violently twisted. The air in my small apartment suddenly felt too thin to breathe. This was no longer a story about a narcissistic father refusing to share the spotlight. This was no longer about a lazy brother cutting corners. This was a fully realized, meticulously planned criminal conspiracy. They had intentionally designated me as the clean, highly credentialed face of their most dangerous gambles. They were quietly building an airtight paper trail that pointed directly to my desk. When the environmental regulators finally arrived with their testing kits, when the entire fragile empire inevitably collapsed under the weight of its own staggering fraud, Robert and Julian would simply walk away. They would hand the federal authorities my digitally signed compliance certificates. They would play the tragic victims of a rogue compliance officer who had hidden the truth from his own trusting family. I followed the digital paper trail away from the fraudulent compliance certificates and toward the actual physical assets of the company. I pulled the deeds for the massive riverfront logistics park. The properties no longer belonged to the primary Mercer corporate entity. They had been quietly and systematically siphoned off, transferred via a series of complex holding trust agreements into a newly formed limited liability company. The sole managing member owning 100% of the voting shares and the profit rights was Julian. I was completely erased from the wealth I had salvaged with my own 2 hands. The fatal knife turned the very next morning. I found a notarized document buried inside a mislabeled manila folder in the physical archives. It was a personal financial guarantee agreement. This document went far beyond a forged electronic signature. This piece of paper legally bound me, personally, to cover the total cost of the toxic cleanup if the corporate development funds ran dry. My personal bank accounts, my future wages, my entire professional livelihood were legally pledged against millions of dollars in potential federal pollution fines. I marched straight up to the executive suite with the physical document shaking in my hand. I walked into my father's office and demanded a complete explanation. Robert calmly took off his reading glasses and folded his hands. He looked at me with the bored expression of a man explaining a basic concept to a slow child. He told me it was merely a temporary measure required by the banks, because Julian was already overextended on other collateral. Then his voice dropped an octave, turning cold and incredibly hard. He looked at me with calculating eyes and said the family had generously taken me in, given me a purpose and a salary. He leaned forward and stated that it was finally time for me to pay my debt to the family. He slid an expensive gold pen across the polished desk. He told me to sign the retroactive confirmation and stop being so dramatic. My jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. A thick vein pulsed at my temple. I stared at the man who shared my blood, realizing he would gladly throw me into federal prison just to save a few acres of poisoned dirt. I refused to touch the pen. I turned around and walked out of the room without saying a single word. Their retaliation was incredibly swift and absolutely total. When I arrived at the corporate building the next morning, my electronic key card flashed solid red. The heavy glass security doors remained locked. I walked back to my car and tried to log into the virtual company server. My administrative access credentials had been completely wiped. The screen simply read, "Access denied." 10 minutes later, a private security courier knocked on my car window. He demanded I immediately surrender my company-issued mobile phone and laptop. By noon, a thick legal envelope was slipped under the front door of my apartment. It was a comprehensive severance package drafted meticulously by Carter. The terms inside the document were legally sickening. If I wanted to receive a meager 2 months of basic living expenses, I had to sign a clause explicitly admitting to severe administrative errors and gross negligence in the compliance department. The package also included an ironclad non-disclosure agreement that would legally gag me for the rest of my natural life. They were trying to force me to purchase my own silence by signing a false confession. I threw the envelope in the trash. But the true suffocating horror of their plan was how fast they weaponized the entire town against me. By Friday evening, a single, perfectly synchronized narrative had flooded the streets of Briar Glen. I heard the whispers at the grocery store. I saw the judgmental stares at the gas station. Robert and Luke, his closest golf partner, had seeded the story with surgical precision through their vast network. The town was buzzing with the tragic news about the Mercer son. People whispered that I had become dangerously unstable. They claimed I was still bitterly acting out over a messy, painful divorce I went through years ago. The story they swallowed whole was that I had completely botched the corporate files out of sheer hysterical incompetence, caused massive financial damage, and then simply ran away. They needed to publicly destroy my credibility so thoroughly that if I ever tried to tell the truth about their frauds, I would sound like nothing more than a crazy, bitter man looking for petty revenge. They left me with zero income, no legal representation, and a ruined reputation in a town that worshipped the very ground they walked upon. I packed my remaining personal belongings into the trunk of my car and drove away to the edge of town. I found a tiny, drafty apartment directly above an old independent pharmacy. The rent was exactly $450 a month. The smell of antiseptic and old dust constantly seeped up through the floorboards. To survive the initial shock of having zero income, I pawned a vintage watch I had bought with my first big corporate bonus. I secured enough cash to keep the lights on and buy groceries. 3 weeks after I moved into the apartment above the pharmacy, my mother passed away. Her death was quiet, a slow fading out that mirrored how she had lived her final years inside that sprawling estate. I attended the funeral, standing at the very edge of the cemetery, far away from the front row where my father and Julian played the roles of the grieving patriarch and the beautiful son. I left before the final prayer. 2 days later, a probate attorney contacted me. I assumed it was about a small inheritance, maybe some old furniture. Instead, he handed me a thick manila envelope. Inside was a small brass padlock key and a piece of paper detailing a lease for a climate-controlled storage unit on the highway. The unit was registered solely in my mother's name. I drove to the facility late at night. I expected to find old photo albums or her collection of antique porcelain. I slid the metal door up. The overhead bulb flickered on. There were no sentimental souvenirs inside. The small room was stacked from floor to ceiling with heavy-duty plastic bins, tightly bound banker boxes, and several metal filing cabinets. It was an archive. My mother, Sarah, had never been a rebel. She never raised her voice at dinner, and she never openly challenged my father. But she was not blind. She knew exactly who she was married to. So, in the total silence of her long marriage, she became a meticulous historian. She hoarded the truth. She kept everything, operating like a ghost, preparing for the inevitable day when the actual facts would need to be proven. I sat on the cold concrete floor and started opening the boxes. The sheer volume of raw data was staggering. I found email chains dating back almost a decade. I found handwritten meeting notebooks. Most importantly, I found a small waterproof lockbox containing 4 external hard drives. I plugged the first drive into my laptop. Contained hundreds of hours of raw audio files. Digital recordings of internal corporate conference calls. I clicked on a file dated roughly 7 months prior. The audio was crystal clear. I heard my father's voice, sharp and commanding, explicitly ordering the finance department to push millions of dollars in secondary vendor payments through the system immediately to bury the invoices before the audit team arrived. I listened to the recordings until the sun came up. This was no longer just my word against theirs. My mother had given me the exact ammunition I needed to tear the empire down. At the bottom of one of the boxes, resting on top of a stack of insurance policies, was a small torn piece of yellow notepad paper. I recognized my mother's slanted handwriting immediately. It was a single sentence. "He is betting that you will be ashamed before he has to be." That sentence hit me like a physical blow. It ripped away the heavy exhaustion and replaced it with a blinding, cold clarity. I folded the small yellow note and put it securely in my pocket. It was time to go to war. Survival requires capital. War requires an endless supply of it. My emergency fund was finite, and I needed an income stream that existed entirely outside the suffocating borders of my home county. I could not risk my father tracking my finances through the local banking network. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I had not called in over 4 years. I called Matthew. Matthew was my former boss back in the city. He was now a senior partner at Blackidge Special Situations. Blackidge was not a standard, polite law firm. They were a boutique corporate warfare outfit. They specialized in handling massive corporate fraud and vicious board control disputes. They were the people you hired when millions of dollars went missing into the dark, and you needed someone ruthless to rip the corporate floorboards up to find the rats. Matthew answered on the second ring. I did not waste his valuable time with a tearful emotional backstory. I laid out the bare bones of my current situation. I told him I was completely cut off, facing aggressive legal threats, and currently preparing to completely dismantle a heavily entrenched local monopoly from the ground up. I asked if he had any remote overflow work for an independent forensic contractor. Matthew listened quietly. He did not offer a single word of easy comfort. He led a long, heavy second pass before he finally spoke. "Do you want to be coddled? Or do you want to win a genuinely difficult case?" he asked. I told him I wanted to win. He hired me on the spot. I became a ghost operative for Blackidge. I sat at the small, rickety wooden table in my drafty apartment and transformed my isolated living space into a tactical forensic command center. Matthew sent me heavily encrypted digital files from massive corporate disputes happening 3 states away. My life became a masterclass in extreme, punishing discipline. Every single day started exactly at 5 in the morning. I laced up my running shoes and ran 6 miles through the dark, freezing streets of the town. I ran past the local diners where men sat drinking cheap coffee, fully believing the vicious lies my family sold them. The grueling physical exhaustion burned away the lingering anxiety. It left my mind entirely clear, sharp, and totally cold. By 7 o'clock, I was sitting at my desk. I spent the next 10 hours doing deep structural analysis for Matthew. I audited massive, convoluted commercial loan portfolios. I tracked hidden payment chains through dense layers of offshore holding companies. I was doing the exact same kind of forensic hunting I needed to do for my own impending case, but I was getting paid $250 an hour to do it for someone else. I deposited my first Blackage paycheck into a brand new, highly secure offshore business account. The sight of those 5 figures hitting the ledger was a moment of pure tactical relief. I finally had my war chest. The massive turning point happened late in the autumn season. Matthew assigned me to an incredibly toxic debt restructuring case based out of Raleigh. A large commercial property developer was actively trying to declare bankruptcy and wipe out over $40 million in unsecured debt. Their defense lawyers were aggressive, incredibly expensive, and extremely confident. I took the developer's entire financial history and broke it down to the absolute molecular level. I spent 90 straight hours comparing their internal ledger dates against the county property tax assessments. Eventually, I found the fatal hidden flaw. I discovered a 14-day window where the subsidiary holding companies technically did not legally exist, meaning the massive asset transfers were legally void from the moment they were signed. I wrote a 40-page forensic analysis detailing exactly how the developer committed systematic bankruptcy fraud. It was a masterpiece of lethal accounting. Matthew took my printed analysis into the final settlement conference in Raleigh. He dropped my report on the polished mahogany table. The opposing counsel read my findings and completely folded within 2 hours. They surrendered entirely. The lead defense attorney for that corrupt developer, the man who was publicly humiliated and whose firm lost millions because of my report, was none other than Carter. The same $1,000 an hour lawyer my father had just hired to crush me. Carter had never seen my face. He only knew the name signed at the bottom of that devastating report, Elijah Watson. He had no idea the crazy, broke son he was preparing to mock in Marlow County was the exact same forensic architect who had already destroyed him. While I was out building this lethal new reality, the external pieces of my own puzzle began falling into my lap almost simultaneously. The isolation of my new life broke on a freezing Tuesday evening. Someone knocked hard on the heavy wooden door of my apartment. I looked through the peephole and saw Dylan standing in the pouring rain. Dylan was the former systems administrator for the entire corporate network. My brother had fired him without warning exactly 14 days prior, publicly blaming him for a massive failure in the digital security protocols. But Dylan was meticulous. Before the private security guards escorted him out, he quietly copied the master access logs onto a heavily encrypted flash drive. I let him inside. He sat at my small kitchen table, opened his laptop, and pulled up the raw server data. He pointed to a specific sequence of glowing green text on the black screen. The server logs provided absolute proof that my administrative credentials had not been hacked by some random outside threat. They were manually overridden and hijacked from an internal Internet Protocol address. That specific address was hardwired directly into Julian's private office. 72 hours later, another ghost from the company payroll reached out. Samuel owned a small, struggling landscaping and site preparation firm. He asked me to meet him at a dark, completely empty diner out on the desolate county highway. His hands physically shook as he held his coffee mug. He confessed that Julian had promised him a guaranteed monthly retainer fee if he allowed Julian to route heavy equipment invoices through his corporate checking account. Samuel was acting as a blind pass-through station for the stolen funds, sending the money directly to Julian's shell companies. He handed me meticulous physical copies of every single routing number. Finally, a senior credit specialist at the regional commercial bank, Gabriel, called me late at night on a disposable prepaid phone. His professional conscience was eating him alive. He confirmed that the internal risk committee at the bank had specifically approved the massive financial exceptions for our newest expansion projects only because my unblemished compliance certifications were attached to the front of the packets. I returned to my apartment and pinned every single piece of gathered evidence to the cracked plaster wall. I used red yarn to connect the financial transactions and blue yarn to connect the digital access logs. I arranged them into a single, cohesive, horrifying narrative of premeditated theft. I had the server logs, the money trail, the bank's admission, and the audio tapes from my mother. I stopped gathering information. I started firing back. I walked straight down to the district courthouse and filed a massive, highly detailed civil lawsuit against the holding company, my father, and my brother. I formally petitioned the court for a total declaratory judgment to completely invalidate the fraudulent personal guarantee bearing my forged digital signature. I knew my father would escalate the war immediately. He would send Carter to bury me in paperwork. But I was ready. I was sitting in the eye of the storm, holding a loaded gun they didn't even know existed. I just had to wait for them to walk into the courtroom and look down at the name on the barrel. I did not wait for my father to launch his next attack. I fired the very first shot. On a quiet, freezing Monday morning, I walked straight down to the district courthouse and filed a massive, highly detailed civil lawsuit against the Mercer Holding Company, against my father Robert, and against my brother Julian. I did not ask for a polite, quiet settlement behind closed doors. I did not send a warning letter. I formally petitioned the court for a total declaratory judgment to completely invalidate the fraudulent personal guarantee bearing my forged digital signature. I demanded a court-ordered injunction to immediately freeze all ongoing corporate asset transfers across their entire real estate portfolio. I requested full, unrestricted forensic access to their internal communications servers. Most importantly, I filed a motion to officially determine my actual structural role within the disputed corporate entities. I wanted to legally destroy their pathetic narrative that I was merely a low-level employee doing basic administrative paperwork. My father did not retreat. He possessed an ego that simply did not comprehend the concept of surrender. To Robert Mercer, the county judicial system was merely another blunt instrument he could comfortably use to enforce total family obedience. He escalated the war immediately. Less than 48 hours after my initial filing, his high-priced legal team filed a vicious, incredibly aggressive countersuit against me. Carter, the ruthless corporate attorney who charged $1,000 an hour, drafted a brutal document that formally painted me as a deeply bitter, emotionally unstable former employee acting entirely out of spite and family jealousy. The countersuit openly accused me of engaging in a malicious campaign of familial harassment. They claimed I was attempting to extort my generous father through frivolous, baseless litigation. Carter deliberately peppered his legal briefs with thinly veiled insults, leaning heavily into the narrative that I was simply a broken man lashing out after a difficult divorce. Carter firmly believed that wrapping my case in the ugly clothing of a domestic dispute would completely blind the judge to the raw financial evidence buried in the exhibits. Robert was executing the classic, brutal game of corporate attrition. He knew I had zero formal income on paper in Briar Glen. He firmly believed his overwhelming financial advantage would crush me. He fully intended to drag out the legal discovery process for years. He planned to bury me under massive mountains of expensive procedural motions and completely drain my limited financial resources until I was forced to sign a suffocating settlement agreement just to avoid living on the street. He planned for a long, slow, agonizing siege. But he fundamentally failed to account for the massive internal weakness of his own son. The sudden, highly public court filing of my lawsuit sent a massive shockwave straight through the regional financial sector. Commercial lenders actively monitor the local court dockets for risk. One of our primary institutional backers read the injunction filing and instantly panicked. They immediately froze a massive multi-million-dollar financial expansion package that Julian desperately needed to keep his new shell companies afloat. They flatly refused to release the pending construction funds until the legal dispute was completely resolved. That single frozen credit line completely shattered my brother's arrogant, untouchable facade. The golden boy panicked entirely. He operated under the terrifying, sudden realization that his untraceable cash flow was completely dead. The public humiliation was a calculated strategy designed to soften me up, but behind closed doors, Julian was breaking apart. Late on a Thursday night, Julian drank entirely too much cheap liquor in the dark corner of his massive modern living room. The frozen commercial credit lines were slowly suffocating his private shell companies, and the immense pressure was cracking his golden boy facade. His tongue grew loose, careless, and incredibly arrogant. He stumbled into the master bedroom and began loudly bragging to his wife about their brilliant, foolproof legal strategy for the following morning. In his drunken stupor, he let slip a massive, fatal secret. He laughed uncontrollably as he admitted that their terrifying lawyer, Carter, had absolutely no idea who he was actually fighting. Carter had thoroughly reviewed several highly specialized financial documents bearing the name Elijah Watson. But the arrogant lawyer had never once connected that professional corporate signature to the broken, emotional son he was preparing to humiliate. Julian's wife sat quietly on the edge of the mattress, listening to her husband ramble and boast. She was entirely sick of the suffocating, toxic Mercer family dynamic. For years, she had silently watched the men in the family constantly force everyone around them to swallow their pride, hide their intelligence, and remain perfectly quiet just to protect fragile male egos. She despised the way they casually destroyed people to maintain their flawless public image. Late that night, long after Julian had passed out face down on the expensive cotton sheets, she picked up her mobile phone. She sent me a highly encrypted, completely anonymous message. She explicitly warned me that the opposing legal team was fully preparing a brutal character assassination protocol. Their entire courtroom strategy relied heavily on painting me as an unqualified, completely hysterical man who had zero professional standing or legal capacity to even read the complex corporate ledgers, let alone audit them for fraud. I sat alone in the dim flickering light of my small apartment and read the glowing text message on my phone screen. I did not panic. I calmly walked over to my desk and opened the thick black binder resting firmly on the wooden surface. I had everything I needed. Meanwhile, Julian woke up in a cold sweat. The alcohol wore off, leaving only blind terror. He rushed back to the executive office at 2 a.m. and began frantically trying to cover his muddy tracks. He started mass deleting sensitive internal emails linking him to the shell companies. He altered digital vendor contracts in the system. He hastily shifted funds between various accounts trying to hide the money from the impending court subpoenas. But Julian was not a systems architect. He was just a thief in a very expensive Porsche 911. He did not realize that every single time he hit the delete key on his keyboard, the main server generated an automatic, highly encrypted backup file in a hidden directory that Dylan, our former IT administrator, had set up months ago. In his absolute desperate panic to destroy the evidence before the judge could see it, the golden boy was systematically generating a massive, irrefutable digital footprint pointing directly toward his own undeniable guilt. The trap was finally springing shut, and they were the ones pulling the lever. Down at the district courthouse, Carter officially filed a massive motion to dismiss my entire lawsuit. But Judge David did not care about country club gossip or expensive legal posturing. He actually read the initial evidence I submitted regarding the backdated property transfers and the manipulated server logs. He immediately issued a decisive ruling that sent a massive shockwave straight through the defense table. He flatly denied Carter's motion to dismiss. Furthermore, he completely bypassed the standard drawn-out written discovery phase that Carter was relying on to drain my funds. He ordered a direct mandatory evidentiary hearing. That specific ruling changed the entire landscape of the war. It meant there would be no hiding behind written affidavits crafted by expensive public relations teams. My father, my brother, and their entire legal team would be forced to sit in a physical room under oath and answer direct questions in front of a live audience. Which brings us directly back to the moment the trial began. Judge David looked down from his elevated wooden bench. He adjusted his microphone and formally asked if I had retained legal representation for this mandatory evidentiary hearing. I stood up slowly. I smoothed the front of my dark blue suit. I looked directly at the judge and kept my voice perfectly level. I stated that I was appearing entirely on my own behalf today, possessing the full professional licensing, the state certifications, and the absolute legal capacity to present the forensic record. At the plaintiff table, Carter was already staring down at the thick black binder I had just submitted to the court clerk. He saw my full legal name printed boldly across the top of the specialized financial exhibits. Elijah Watson. He saw the specific registry numbers and the highly unique surgical formatting of the data reconstructions. The remaining color completely drained from his face. The agonizing memory of a massive, incredibly humiliating legal defeat in Raleigh exactly 2 years ago hit him like a physical blow. The brilliant remote forensic architect who had completely dismantled his defense strategy and cost his prestigious firm millions of dollars in that famous settlement was not a ghost. He was standing right across the aisle. Carter's heavy gold pen slipped from his fingers. It clattered loudly onto the wooden table. He flipped quickly to the next page, then the next. He turned the pages faster and faster. His breathing changed. The smug, relaxed posture vanished instantly. His shoulders tensed so hard they practically touched his ears. The healthy color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified old man facing a firing squad. He leaned forward, his nose almost touching the paper. He whispered, and the courtroom was so utterly silent that his whisper carried across the tense gap between our tables. "My God, is that really him?" Robert turned his head to look at his high-priced lawyer. For the first time in his long, arrogant life, my father saw Carter lose his rhythm. Carter was not looking at the judge. He was not looking at my father. He was staring dead at me. His eyes were wide, filled with a sudden, suffocating panic. He was looking at me like I was a predator that had just quietly locked the courtroom doors from the inside. Robert shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The triumphant, mocking smile slipped right off his face. Complete confusion replaced it. He looked from his terrified lawyer to the stack of papers, and then finally he looked back at me. He tried to find the frightened son he used to yell into submission. He tried to find the son who always backed down to save the family name. I met his gaze. I did not blink. I felt my pulse beating slow, calm, and steady. I was totally at peace. I did not waste the court's time with a dramatic theatrical performance. I did not stand in the center of the room and deliver a tearful, emotional speech about family betrayal or moral failings. The time for feelings had passed months ago. Now was the time for the blade. I opened my files and began systematically linking the heavy steel chains tight around their necks. I introduced the certified server logs that proved the internal identity theft, showing exactly how my administrative access was hijacked from inside the executive suite. I laid out the complex wire transfer receipts detailing the illegal backyard vendor network Julian had built. I presented the forged personal guarantee they had secretly attached to the toxic warehouse site. I displayed the illegally backdated county land deeds side by side with their own internal corporate emails. Those emails explicitly outlined their premeditated intention to shift the massive environmental liabilities onto my desk while hiding the clean assets in newly formed shell companies. The absolute truth did not just come from my mouth. It came from the very people they had casually discarded and manipulated. I called Dylan to the witness stand. The former network administrator raised his right hand, swore to tell the truth, and then systematically dismantled Julian's lie about a software glitch. Dylan presented the raw IP logs, proving under oath that the digital security overrides and the forged digital signatures were executed entirely from the hardwired computer inside Julian's private office. Next, I called Gabriel, the senior regional bank specialist. He gripped the edges of the witness stand nervously, fully aware he was risking his own career. He testified clearly that millions of dollars in risky commercial credit were only approved for the Riverfront project because my unblemished professional reputation as a compliance officer was attached as a shield to the fraudulent loan applications. The bank trusted Elijah Watson, not Robert Mercer. Then I called Samuel, The small landscaping business owner took the microphone and his voice shook as he confirmed the blind. Illegal money routing through his business account. He handed over the physical deposit slips, matching perfectly with the routing numbers of Julian's hidden shell companies. Everything perfectly locked together. The invisible, suffocating web my family thought they had so cleverly spun in the dark was now a giant, undeniable steel cage sitting directly under the bright fluorescent lights of the courtroom. The breaking point arrived during cross-examination. I called my brother to the stand. Julian walked up to the wooden box looking like a hollow, terrified shell of the golden boy he used to be. The frozen commercial credit lines and the crushing weight of the incoming evidence had completely destroyed his nerves. He gripped the wooden railing so hard his knuckles turned stark white. I did not yell at him. I did not pace around the room. I stood perfectly still and relentlessly boxed him into a corner using his own conflicting metadata and his panicked deleted emails. I handed him a printed server log from a Tuesday night in late October. I asked him to read the Internet Protocol address out loud. He mumbled the numbers, sweat beading on his forehead. Then I handed him the physical security badge swipe records for that exact same night. I calmly asked him to explain to the judge how my verified electronic signature was actively approving a highly toxic waste site assessment at the exact same moment my physical body was logged as being miles away from the corporate building. Under that crushing, clinical pressure, Julian completely snapped. His voice cracked loudly, echoing off the high ceiling. He practically yelled his desperate confession into the microphone. He frantically admitted that they had forged my signature. He completely abandoned any sense of family loyalty. He tried to save himself by throwing our father directly under the bus. Julian cried out that Robert had explicitly ordered him to bypass the safety protocols. He shouted that our father assured him I would eventually just clean up the massive administrative mess for the family like I always did. He confessed that they truly believed they had the absolute right to use my name and my credentials without ever asking for my permission, simply because I was family. Judge David did not need to retreat to his chambers to deliberate. The absolute scale of the financial fraud and the sheer cruelty of the setup were staggering. He leaned forward, his eyes blazing with professional fury, and issued a rapid, devastating series of bench rulings right there on the spot. He instantly ordered a total freeze on all disputed corporate assets across their entire real estate portfolio. He legally and permanently voided the fraudulent personal guarantee bearing my forged signature, severing me entirely from their toxic environmental debt. He granted me full unrestricted access to the entire history of the corporate records. He officially appointed a ruthless independent forensic firm to audit the entire Mercer holding structure. Before he struck his heavy wooden gavel to close the hearing, Judge David looked directly down at my father. He stated for the permanent public court record that my structural role in the Mercer system was a foundational, highly critical pillar of the business. He explicitly noted that my work was never merely basic paperwork support, entirely destroying the pathetic, demeaning narrative my father had peddled to the town for months. The sharp, echoing crack of the judge's gavel signaled the absolute end of the Mercer reign. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the room swung open, and the gallery began to slowly empty. The local business owners, the country club elites, and the church elders who had come to watch me burn were now entirely silent. They rushed out of the room, keeping their heads down, desperate to call their financial brokers and distance themselves from the Mercer name as quickly as humanly possible. The whispers of my mental instability were instantly replaced by the terrifying reality of federal fraud investigations. The heavy, suffocating silence of total, absolute defeat settled over the defense table. Carter did not offer a single word of comfort to his clients. The legendary corporate executioner was already frantically packing his expensive leather briefcase. He shoved his gold pen and his legal pads into the bag, refusing to even look Robert or Julian in the eye. He knew his own firm was about to be investigated for submitting fraudulent documents to the court. He practically sprinted down the center aisle, pushing past the remaining spectators, desperate to escape the courtroom before the stench of the Mercer collapse ruined his own career forever. I stood at the plaintiff table and quietly stacked my documents back into the heavy cardboard boxes. I did not gloat. I did not smile. I felt a profound, deep sense of closure. Robert slowly stood up from the defense table. His broad shoulders were slumped forward, completely stripped of their usual arrogance. The untouchable titan of Briar Glen suddenly looked like a very old, very broken man. The expensive charcoal suit seemed to hang loosely on his frame, as if the physical power had been drained right out of his bones. He slowly walked over to my table. He looked down at the massive boxes of evidence, the color-coded binders that had just dismantled his entire life's work. Then he looked up at me. His eyes searched my face. He was looking for any trace of the desperate son who used to beg for his approval, the loyal boy who would eventually cave and offer to fix everything. He found absolutely nothing. His voice was quiet, almost a fragile whisper, entirely devoid of the booming authority he had weaponized against me for decades. "Is this your idea of revenge?" he asked. I looked him dead in the eyes. I felt absolutely nothing for him anymore. No anger, no sadness, no lingering desire for his validation. The emotional cord had been completely and permanently severed. I gave him the cold, precise truth. "No," I said, my voice steady and completely empty of emotion. "This is the bill for all the times you confused silence with consent." I turned my back on him for the final time. I grabbed the handle of my rusted metal dolly and pushed it down the center aisle of the courtroom. The squeak of the wheels echoed loudly, the only sound left in the massive room. I did not look back. I did not stay to claim the broken throne of his crumbling company. I did not want a single dirty brick of his ruined empire. I pushed the heavy double doors open and walked down the wide stone steps of the courthouse. The freezing morning rain had finally stopped, leaving the air sharp, clear, and incredibly fresh. I stepped out into the daylight with my entire identity fully and legally restored. The collapse of the Mercer Empire was not a slow, graceful decline. It was a catastrophic, violent freefall. In the weeks that followed the explosive hearing, the independent forensic firm appointed by the judge completely dismantled the corporate holding structure. They ripped through the cooked books, exposed the shell companies, and handed their devastating final report directly to the federal authorities. The environmental regulators descended on the riverfront property. They conducted deep soil tests and discovered contamination levels far worse than initially feared. They issued astronomical federal fines that instantly bankrupted the primary corporate entity. The regional banks, terrified of the toxic liability, immediately called in their massive commercial loans. When the company could not pay, the asset seizures began. I was not in Briar Glen to watch it happen, but the news traveled fast. The local paper printed front-page photos of federal agents in windbreakers carrying heavy boxes of hard drives out of the corporate headquarters. The bank foreclosed on the sprawling family estate. Robert was forced to stand on the manicured lawn and watch as the repo men loaded his pristine, custom-ordered Rolls-Royce Ghost onto a flatbed tow truck. Julian did not fare any better. The federal authorities seized all assets tied to his fraudulent shell companies. They towed his beloved Porsche 911 right out of his driveway in broad daylight. The prestigious country club formally revoked their memberships. The untouchable family was left with absolutely nothing but massive legal bills and the terrifying, looming threat of federal prison time for wire fraud, identity theft, and environmental negligence. The town of Briar Glen, the exact same people who had so eagerly swallowed the vicious lies about my mental instability, suddenly suffered a massive collective case of amnesia. They stopped talking about the crazy Mercer son. Instead, they gathered at the local diners and hardware stores, whispering over their coffee cups about how they always knew Robert and Julian were crooked. They retroactively pretended they had always been on my side, entirely rewriting their own history of complicity. I did not care. I had already moved on completely. I officially packed up my small apartment above the pharmacy and relocated back to the city. Matthew kept his word. After the massive success of the Raleigh case and the flawless, surgical execution of my own lawsuit, Blackage Special Situations offered me a massive promotion. I did not just get my standard salary back. I was given an equity partnership in a firm that actually respected my mind and feared my capabilities. My name, Elijah Watson, became a terrifying legend in the highly insular world of corporate litigation. I was the ghost who walked into broken companies, ripped up the floorboards, and exposed the rats. Corrupt executives and arrogant defense lawyers double-checked their own files whenever they heard my name, terrified that I was quietly auditing their ledgers from a dark room 3 states away. I built a beautiful, peaceful life for myself. I bought a house with a wide front porch and a quiet, sunlit study where I could drink my black coffee in the mornings without ever having to look over my shoulder. I completely severed all contact with my former family. A year later, a thick envelope arrived at my office. It was from Julian's new, much cheaper defense attorney, begging me to provide a character reference letter for his upcoming criminal sentencing to help him avoid a maximum security facility. I did not even bother opening the formal request. I fed it directly into the shredder and went back to work. I had survived the fire, and I had forged myself into something completely unbreakable. I was no longer a quiet shadow trapped inside the suffocating, toxic walls of my father's kingdom. I was a man who had meticulously rebuilt the truth entirely by the book, at the exact right moment. Looking back at the entire nightmare, the long days of isolation, the crushing weight of public humiliation, and the ultimate victory in that courtroom, I realized the most dangerous trap in life is blind loyalty. Specifically, blind loyalty to people who view your love as a weakness to be actively exploited. For 35 years, I let the word family keep me chained to a system that was actively destroying my soul. I let them convince me that demanding respect was selfish, and that suffering in silence was a noble virtue. They thought my silence was weakness. They thought my refusal to shout, scream, and throw tantrums meant I was completely powerless. They did not understand that while they were busy demanding applause, shaking hands, and driving expensive cars bought with stolen money, I was quietly studying the architecture of their entire world. I learned how the walls were built, and more importantly, I learned exactly where the foundational cracks were hidden. The truly dangerous person in a room is never the one shouting the loudest. It is never the man with the most expensive custom suit, the massive gold watch, or the biggest local reputation. The truly dangerous person is the quiet professional sitting at the table, who knows exactly which specific piece of paper will make the loudest opponent lose their voice completely. I walked away from Briar Glen knowing I had forced the most dangerous lawyer in the state to recognize my absolute power long before my own father ever did. I lost a toxic family, but I gained the entire world, and I finally secured the peace I deserved. Thank you for sticking around and listening to my story. I hope this resonated with you in some way. We all face moments in life where the people we trust the most try to push us down into the dirt, fully expecting us to just stay there and take it. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation, where you had to stand entirely alone to fight for your own truth and set a hard boundary? Let me know down in the comments. Also, if you are hearing this right now, you are part of a very special group. I want you to drop the letter W in the comments section. W stands for winner. That is the secret code for the 1% Club. The sign to let me know you are one of the amazing people who watched this story all the way to the very end. You guys are the absolute best. Please hit that like button and follow the channel so we can keep sharing these incredible journeys together. Stay strong, trust your instincts, and I will see you in the next story.